Welcome to Greenwich and the Environment. I'm Diva Wareing, your host, ready to take you on a journey through the heart of creativity, culture, research and sustainability at Greenwich. So, whether you're passionate about the planet or just curious about the hidden forces shaping our world, stick around. This is where sustainability meets creativity. Let's get started. In today's episode, we will be discussing how being in nature can help us to engage with sustainability. So, we encourage you, if you can, to pause the recording and in the spirit of the episode, go for a walk, head to a park, or sit in your garden whilst listening to this episode to fully embrace the experience. With me in the studio today, we have two guests, Anushka Athique and Hannah Lammin. Both are lecturers at the University of Greenwich. Anushka is a landscape architect with over 15 years of experience in embodied practice of site analysis, while Hannah is a media philosopher exploring how effective experiences emerge through interactions between people, spaces, and technologies. Their latest project, Landscape Encounters, investigates how sensory and participatory creative practice can help us to develop empathy for the natural spaces we inhabit. We're here today to discuss how artistic practice, movement, and sensory engagement can deepen our understanding of the environment and lead to more sustainable ways of living. Hi, Anushka and Hannah. How are you both today?
Great,
Hi.
thank you.
Great,
thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been super exciting, and I'm really excited to speak to you guys. I guess to start with, let's just both chat about your background and where you came from and how you've arrived to where you are now.
Okay, so hi, I'm Hannah. I originally trained as a dancer, actually, and I came to philosophy a bit later in my life. And on the way to that, I was involved in some very site-specific creative practice in urban environments. I worked with a collective called Random Artists. We would occupy disused spaces and turn them into kind of creative social spaces and sort of temporary events. And I came into academia because I was interested in examining that practice, and somewhere along the way it took me towards media theory and things like that. And I think that what brought me to this project was that in recent years, having spent a long time away from the physical practice that I started with, I've been learning circus arts, acrobatics, aerial and things like that. And it's sort of changed the way that I think about my body and the way that I interact with spaces again, and made that kind of embodied sense of the world much more tangible. And Anushka and I happened to sit next to each other in the office, so they were in different portfolios, and just came quite organically out of some conversations. I do have an interest in the kind of outdoors as well, and we sort of formed an idea of doing something. So we both have some experience in performance design as well, which is a meeting point in the middle.
Yeah, similar to Hannah, I started off in performance, but differently. My background is in theatre design. So what I was interested in is really about designing or curating the atmospherics of a space and using that to tell a story. That was my previous practice. And then I stepped into landscape architecture, which for me is a much more formal way of doing the same thing. It's creating atmospheres and spaces where people can be. It's kind of come full circle where I'm now trying to merge the two things back together. So landscape architecture practice, but really also teaching practice with more performative methodologies. And at the moment I'm doing a PhD where I'm looking at the idea of the site and the body as being these two porous entities that co-create spaces and worlds. And for me, that's where the project sits, the project that Landscape Encounters that Hannah and I have been working on.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and especially like when you just said that the body and the landscape are these two beings, because I guess it kind of is like, our bodies are living things. Like when you look at the enzymes that live in our guts and everything else, and the mites that are in our eyelashes and stuff, like they are as living as the environment we live in. Yeah, okay, amazing. That's super interesting. And I guess, can you tell us a little bit about the project and the research that we're here to discuss?
So far we've kind of started by running a kind of pilot, which was a residential workshop where we took a group of participants out into a rural space, and we camped, and we spent some time kind of slowing ourselves down and attuning ourselves to the space that we were in through some kind of practices of kind of walking, observing, thinking about the kind of embodied sensations and noticing things around us. And then we built from that with some sort of things that had different types of movement. And we started to think about how different types of beings in a landscape kind of interact with each other, and think about the different ways in which we sense the world, but then also other types of entities. So those might be, insects, and they might be plants, and they might be fungi or lichen or these other types of things. And so the workshop worked towards a point where we would then start thinking, how might we alter our bodies by making kind of things out of straightforward materials that we could kind of wear or put on, so we could start sensing the world a bit more like a different type of being. So the whole point of it is to think about the way that landscapes grow through interactions between lots of different agents, living, maybe even not living, stones and sand and soil and things like that. Soil is actually quite a living thing, though. But also to think about our kind of empathic relationship with those other entities.
A little while back, I did a project with a forester called Matt Taylor, and he was always talking about this idea of the human animal, and he was talking to me about how, as humans, we've displaced a lot of species within the forest, wild boar, for example, who had really key roles in maintaining that forest ecosystem. And he felt that as a forester, he needed to replicate the role of the boar through scurrying and moving seeds around and disturbing the ground. And for me, that really kind of inspired me as well, this idea of how can we change our bodies to think like other bodies. And I think that was, whilst we weren't trying to maintain the forest habitat that we were working in any way, it was about understanding the kind of life worlds that these other species created. And like Hannah said, not just the big animals, but also moss and lichen and these kind of very small things, but have a huge role to play. And how can we attune our own bodies to those kind of sensibilities?
Yeah. And with this, when people were in these spaces, did you find that, what were the findings of it? Did you find that people were feeling more connected to nature, or were they feeling what were some of the emotions that came up from these participants?
I think very much so. There was by the end of it, quite a deep connection with the site we were in. And it was helped by the atmospherics of that weekend or 2 days that we were there, and that it rained. I don't know if you remember last summer, we had so much rain.
Yeah.
And in the weeks leading up to it, it was just rain. And when we got there, it kind of eased up a bit, and we were undercover because we were in the trees. But there was something about this kind of damp atmosphere as well that slowed us down. We had to really concentrate and focus on what we were doing. And I think there were definitely moments of frustration amongst the participants. But also, they did slow down, and they did really start to kind of think about themselves more on a par with the kind of other species we were working with, rather than just working on top of the forest.
And when they were in there and they were moving with their bodies, what sort of thing, how if you could visualize what it looked like were they in the trees? Were they rolling in mud? How did it look?
We the space that we went to is called Wilderness Wood. It's in East Sussex, and it's got a range of different kind of biomes within it. So some of the time we were in sort of deciduous woodland amongst chestnut trees and things like this, and there are other parts, so we were among pine trees. Some of there are areas with paths, and some areas that don't have trees. We camped in a grassy space, and we also had a space to work in that had a roof over it, although was still open air, so that we could sort of shelter from the rain as well while we were eating and making. So there were different spaces, and there were a range of activities that we kind of went exploring in a way together. It started with walking, and progressively walking more slowly. And we asked them to do, different things at certain points, to close their eyes and see what it takes to move without looking. What sort of sensibility do we have to have? How much do we rely on our memory? How much do we start to feel our feet on the ground? Or, what do we need to do to feel safe if we're moving through a space without vision? Do we protect ourselves with our arms? Do we, how do we find our balance? And then we started doing things that were a little more out of the ordinary. I asked people to sort of work in pairs with a cord connecting them, and what does it take to keep the tension just gently, so that you're having to work out how you can work with that person. You become a combined entity. Later, there were some other activities. Do you want to talk to some of the sort of tracing of?
Yeah, so walking was one of our key ways of engaging with the environment. And then we also did these kind of drawing or recording exercises where we asked the participants to choose a species and go and record it. And we gave them quite simple materials like A2, cartridge paper, charcoal. They could use the mud and the leaves and the textures from the ground. And I think string and
bits of string, yeah. So we made sure, because we knew we were going into a landscape, that everything was biodegradable, basically. We didn't want to take things that were going to leave microplastics behind. So there was chalk and charcoal, and there was, paper and card and string. But everything was made out of stuff that, if we left traces of it, it would return to the soil. Yeah. So we were sort of thinking, how do we carve out the shapes? How do we what does it take to make a different type of map that shows us a kind of sensory idea of the forest? And some of it we did kind of all together in one space, and then we let people go off on their own and follow something that gave them particular interest, so they could deepen those observations.
And I think that's when we found, or looking back at the photographs we took, that they were starting to get closer to the ground as well. So walking, we were obviously quite upright. And then when we were asking them to draw, they were on the ground, crouching, using the material, so kind of using their other senses. Sometimes they were just sitting, listening, feeling the wind. So it was this kind of range of ways that they then developed themselves, and then try to create ways of recording that through mark making.
Interesting. And then, so this is all about being with the bodies and experiencing with bodies. And I come from a performance background, so I've been in movement classes. I've done these exercises where you walk around, you've got your eyes closed, and you're trying not to bump into each other. And then for the first 2 minutes, you're bumping into everyone, and then you kind of get this equilibrium almost between everybody. So when you were saying that, I was thinking, oh my God, think of the tree roots that you'd be falling over and all these things. Because I was always terrible at that anyway. But and it makes me think of, then once you are in that space and once you're in that kind of flow state, you would feel it a lot more. And you'd kind of, I think when you were saying, you feel the ground in your feet, like having that moment to just think about, this is we walk every day and we're thinking about tomorrow or lunch or the argument we just had or whatever it is, and to actually stop and feel sand in your feet or soil or trees or listen to the wind or something like that. It's it is that connecting moment, isn't it? And how do you think that using bodies in general can be a positive learning experience, regardless of whether it's the environment or anything?
I think it allows it to be automatically quite personal to that person. They kind of bring the ideas and interpret them within their own kind of frame of reference and within their own capabilities for movement. We weren't asking them to do any particular movements, it could be anything. And it also, I think that kind of allows a certain translation to happen between some of the theories we were looking at, which are quite complicated. We weren't addressing directly during the 2 days we were there. So it was this kind of like practical application of these ideas through their bodies. And I think working with bodies in that way, like it's just working with the ordinary body. It's not a dancer's body or working with a trained body. It allows, things to become personal. And that allows ideas to develop, I think.
I absolutely agree. And I also think one of the things that really interests me in a general sense now in this project, but also beyond it, is having spent quite a few years working in philosophy, which is a discipline that tends to be very wordy. I'm very interested at the moment in thinking about other ways in which thought comes into being, which can be through visual or audible or, proprioceptive practices. And I think that there's something about moving from states of abstraction into something actual, that the idea that things have shape and form and experiential material aspects to them is very important. So I think that in general in learning, you can really lose people if you spend too much time. Some people love abstract thinking, but it's quite a rarefied thing, actually. Every so often you'll meet someone who just is a natural mathematician, and like for them they can be in a world of numbers and they just see it and it makes sense. Most of us can't do that. So I actually think that the things that come through these more embodied experiences, they make things real in a way that allows us to actually think, how can I have an effect on this? How can I, something that can be manipulated and changed. And that's a really important part of learning.
And it uncomplicates things as well, because we all have bodies and we all use them every day. And like you said, we walk every day. We do these things automatically. We breathe every day. We eat, it's all the things we were doing. So we know how to do it. It's not like writing an essay or a paper or doing a piece. It doesn't feel like doing a piece of research.
It's accessible to everybody.
And I quite like that.
And we had a sort of evaluation workshop after the residential where we brought the participants back together and asked them to kind of map what they'd done and the things that they'd made, and also to reflect on the experience. And, we got some really valuable, thoughtful feedback from that. And many of them, I think we all felt it. I mean, it began with that we'd arranged a train for them all to travel down on, and we kind of met them from the station to take them to the site, and their train got cancelled. So everybody was running late and we had to change our schedule. We had to fit around the weather. We had to sort of make things up as we went along. But it was, the challenge of actually slowing down, the challenge of actually not looking at the world through the smartphone and taking the pictures. And for one or two of the participants, it took them a while. We asked them to sort of leave their phones, and for a while they were still feeling the need to photograph the things they were looking at, and then reflecting on the fact that after a while they were able to put that away. But how long it takes to step away from the pace that is set for us by our work lives, our study lives, our urban lives, what it means to be fitting around a train schedule, what it means to be hurrying. I'm a hurrier. I move really fast. I always, and actually it's such a, giving oneself permission to slow down. But also people commented on how frustrating it was being asked, on the second day we woke up in the morning and we went for this really slow walk and asked everybody, Anushka set a beat, and it was really slow, and we had to all walk at this pace that was much slower than we would normally walk at in order to get into this other rhythm. And one of the participants wrote this, really, really kind of beautiful thing about how frustrating it was and how important that frustration was as well, because, we do all know how to walk, but we don't often notice ourselves doing it.
I think you're so right. And I think with slowing down and taking a moment, like I was in a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and it was a no phones workshop, and it was a 2-day thing. I mean, you went in the evening, went home and came back. But that first day when we were there, and we didn't have our phones for the whole day from like 9 to 5, I was like, got to like lunchtime, and I was sat there. I mean, I think during the day it's fine because you're learning and things like that, but at lunchtime, like automatically you want to pick it out your pick out your pocket and just scroll or reply to people, and it's getting out of that habit of constantly going to do it and getting into like a habit of being like, oh, actually I can just sit and have a conversation with these people. It's actually quite nice. Yeah, it is interesting. I feel like, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like more people seem to be moving away from, or there seems to be some sort of movement from being on social media as much and things like that, which could help with slowing down and taking, I think it's so chaotic on social media. You need to be able to block it out sometimes. And yeah, how do you think having this reflection and people being able to slow down and giving themselves the space to slow down will and can help the environmental movement?
I think that that there's almost like two sides of what happens within this experience, and one of them has to do with something that's quite personal and almost it's a well-being thing. You know, this question, the observation you've made, and I've been seeing it in students. I mean, I teach media and communications, so I spend a lot of time with students, you know, asking them to reflect on what they do with the media that they engage with. And even over the last couple of years, I'm seeing a distinct change in what students are telling me about the way they deal with things like taking selfies, for example, and much more guarded. My current intake of students about how they use their own image online than students even a year or two earlier were. So I think that what we've seen in the last few years is a huge explosion of platform technologies. At the moment, it's the AI things that are the thing that we're suddenly being flooded with. And people adapt surprisingly quickly, actually, and start to realise what it is they need to do in terms of engaging with those things. But coming back to the environment question, I think that, you know, we're obviously living at a point in time where nobody can escape awareness of debates around, you know, anthropogenic climate change, about the questions about what needs to be changed and how in order to perhaps avert what might be a really big catastrophe. And I think one of the problems is that it's a challenge on a global scale that we hear about a lot, and yet each of us feels, you know, probably, if we stop and think about it, quite stressed. It's quite a tense thing to know that you're living in this time of crisis, and each of us feels a sense of perhaps responsibility, but also we don't feel empowered to do anything because we're all so tiny. So I think in terms of what does it mean for sustainability, encouraging people to understand better their connection with other living things in that kind of joined up way. Maybe, you know, those of us who live urban lives and we buy our food from supermarkets and it's wrapped in plastic, we don't have a lot of a connection with the roots that it comes through and things like that. It's easy to feel very separated. You know, it's like the countryside, the environment, nature, or whatever. It's a word I'm very suspicious of, but it's somewhere over there. And it doesn't feel like the choices that I have can have a big impact. But actually, I think that there are all sorts of forms of cooperation, things that start to change attitudes. I think about the way that, I don't know, attitudes to plastic bags changed dramatically, reusable drinking bottles and things like this. That each of them is a small thing, but it doesn't actually take that long once you really bring it to people's attention to get people to change their behaviour. So I kind of think that these practices of attunement, in some ways they can be in small ways empowering, and I think that more positive and sustainable relationships with our broader environment are going to depend in no small part on smaller collaborations. It's not, you know, there are big agents that need to change their behaviour, but, you know, we can also do things at local levels. We can work with types of community. Look at the way that attitudes towards planting and parklands and things like that have changed over the last few years. Parks don't look like they used to because people have different expectations about what's important now.
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything Hannah's just said. And it's like a reset that is needed, perhaps, about understanding that we're relational and connected and not just these kind of individual bounded people, entities, identities that kind of move around separately. But actually our impact is on each other is much more kind of nuanced and reciprocal. And when I say each other, I don't just mean like human to human, but human to non-human species as well. However, Hannah was saying like she's noticed this big change amongst her students of how they kind of use technology and social media. I have as well, but in a very different way. And what I see is much more increasing need to mediate between your bodily experience and the landscape and the site, teaching landscape architecture. There's always, like if I say observe something, that tends to mean take a picture of it.
Interesting.
And it's like that kind of memory or that cognitive function is held outside of the body now on the phone. And whilst I'm not anti-technology at all, because I think it's super useful in being able to like amplify what we already or what we experience or find other kind of ways of experiencing things, it's that holding it outside of the body that kind of scares me a little bit, actually.
And your research, I guess, brings it back to the body.
Yeah.
And you guys didn't have phones and things. You wanted people to really absorb it. And did you, with the feedback that you got, did anybody say that they remembered it in a different way than how they might normally? Or maybe you didn't ask that question.
There was one participant in particular that held onto her phone for a lot longer. And I can't remember exactly what she wrote, but she did write something about that moment when she realised she didn't need to use it.
Wow.
Because I don't think she was even consciously realising she was recording images on her phone. It was just a habit. So that was quite interesting, I thought.
I mean, we did, we gave each of the participants a little sketchbook and at points asked them to, record their thoughts about things, their observations within those sketchbooks, which included drawing, mark making, as I say, drawing different types of kind of maps, kind of asking people, how might you record these different levels of layers of sensation, what might that look like, but also to take notes about their experience. And so it's not that we weren't using technologies, but we were using much more old-fashioned ones, going back to the mark making and the writing. So I think that it's a different, it's not that when we choose to take a photo, there is an active noticing that goes on there, but like maybe we then leave it in that photos folder and it goes somewhere else. And I think that the sketchbook, and we took scans of the sketchbooks, but we let the participants have them. It was their work that they could keep as well after that. So I think that's quite important. And also we haven't talked so much about on the second day, we actually made things that were wearable stuff that we then experimented being in a space whilst wearing. So that was another type of object that was a kind of tangible a physicalized memory, I suppose, of what we did.
Yeah, on what you just said, how was that for the participants to wear these things? So did they go and choose one particular thing that they were observing and then make something like that, or did they have multiple? It
was a fairly open-ended brief. So on the first day, towards the end, we'd ask them to go and observe a particular type of entity in detail, and we talked over dinner. So we did a lot of eating together through the process of that. We haven't talked about it, but it was really important, the coming together and eating and making sure everybody was well fed, and that as a communal activity as well. And we asked people to sort of reflect a bit on what might it take to kind of change your body so that you might experience like another body, as a kind of thought just before we went to bed. And we were very tired and we all went to bed really early. And then, so we were sort of building on that the next day, and it was quite an open-ended invitation, really. It's like they could choose the entity that they'd been observing the day before, and some of them did. You know, some interpreted it in slightly more metaphorical ways, where they'd thought about particular types of, you know, what does it mean to make your hands long? What does it mean to add something with a kind of that makes a sound when you move to remind you of what you're doing? So the ways in which the brief was interpreted were quite diverse. There was one of the participants who said, you know, I'm finding this really hard, in the sense that, you know, not like that it was a bad thing, but it was a challenge, because they were someone that, so the participants were all people who were students from the design school here at the University of Greenwich, who'd volunteered, you know, they'd opted in. Some of them were in architecture, some of them were in landscape architecture, and we had someone from graphic design background as well. And it was someone who was used to designing much more in a kind of 2D way.
So none of these people were dancers or anything
like
that?
No, definitely not. So they hadn't, you know, the making was like thinking how I can turn this into a 3D form that I can just make in an afternoon, was like, you know, I'm having to really stretch myself with this. This is out of my comfort zone. And not that was like negative feedback, but that it had been a challenging thing. So it wasn't necessarily working in ways that participants were used to.
And again, we gave them a palette of materials. We had some calico, we had some wool that could be used for padding, some wire and some string, and some, like, scissors and the scalpels. So it was about...
And a lot of, like, we were using sticks and things that we found, you know, in the environment.
Yeah, so it was very much they were making prototypes as well. So I think even the ones who are used to probably working in 3 dimensions is within the workshop downstairs with all the machinery and, you know, a lot of planning. And I think, I can't really actually remember what the question was, but I think they got on board with it really well. Actually, they were very focused on what they were doing, and it was a very quiet atmosphere. And as like this workshop facilitator, I had to kind of stop myself from trying to like get the energy up, actually, because normally you would try and, well, I would try and do that in a different type of workshop setting. But actually it was, again, I think very reflective of the atmosphere, because it was damp and heavy, and they were really kind of thinking about those species that they were looking at and trying to adapt their bodies to.
Be interesting to do the research again, like on a day like today, which is very sunny and higher pressure, and how that would change the dynamic of the group and the energies and what the outcomes would be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what sort of things were in that environment? What sort of entities were there? What sort of living objects or creatures?
Well, it was it's an ancient coppice woodland, so it's been coppice since Roman times. So it has a very rich biodiversity, and like Hannah said at the beginning, there's different biomes. So there were areas of deciduous coppice woodland, and then areas of pine trees. They grew Christmas trees on one side. It was a community working woodlands.
Sorry, can you explain really quickly what coppice means for people that...
So it's a management practice where, depending on the species, so for example, for a hazel tree, you would cut it right down to its base every 3 years. I mean, you would normally do that to a third of the area, and that would happen in rotation. So what that allows the tree to do is to regrow from the base. So you'll have like multiple trunks coming up, and you would cut them down again when they're quite thin, probably like hazel grows really quickly, so maybe like 2 centimetres in diameter, and that could be used as building materials or for firewood. So it was a management practice since Roman times. It's still carried on in our woodlands.
Nice. And with the creatures and the insects that were there, were they the stuff that you'd find in an urban environment, or were they very different? Or was it more plants and lichen that they were finding?
The students were really looking mostly at lichen and moss, actually. Yeah. And some of them were looking at ants.
Yeah.
But it was really lichen and moss that kind of caught everyone's
which is interesting. And I also think at different times of year, I mean, lichen and moss you find all times of year, but you know, if one went there in the autumn, there'd probably be a lot more signs of the sort of fungal things. You know, you get a lot of mushrooms and things would grow at certain times of year, and other time, you know, if you went in the winter, like what is it, you know, the sort of growth is more sparse because deciduous trees are kind of in a dormant phase and things. And so I think again the seasons kind of dictate a bit what's available. But it happened that the people who were with us, a lot of them did focus on these very slow organisms that kind of spread and grow over long time periods, and thinking about what that is as a thing. And
I think it's probably fairly, like, the biodiversity is fairly typical of a woodland in that area. I don't think it's like a site, it's not a site of specific scientific interest or anything like that. It's a typical working woodland that has people moving through it regularly. However, very different from an urban environment or an urban parkland.
Yeah.
And I think some of our participants weren't used to that. Even ones who were kind of used, there was quite an international group as well, actually. So
some of the people who decided to participate was that they wanted an opportunity to kind of go out into the countryside because, you know, as international students, maybe they've arrived here on a plane, they've got a train, they've got their accommodation, they might use the buses, they might walk, maybe they ride a bike. But actually, if you're kind of living without maybe like car type transport of your own,
it's
London,
hard to get out.
You're not necessarily going to get out into the green spaces. And so for some of them, it was like, I really feel like I could do with some time to go out and connect with something a bit more green. But they were also telling us about like parks that they'd found and other spaces that, you know, that were interesting. And there are more urban nature reserves than there used to be. You know, there's a lot of spaces if you go out looking for them in London where you can find, you know, old cemeteries where they've very deliberately allowed things to overgrow, and, you know, one finds other types of ecosystems developing, I suppose. But I think part of what we're, you know, this was a pilot project, and we recruited students because they were a group of people we had access to in terms of inviting them, and partly that because we had a limited amount of time, we kind of wanted people who already were kind of in the flow of types of learning practices. But one thing we're interested in doing as we develop this is thinking about how could we translate this to wider participant groups. There might be community groups, there might be multi-generational, you know, how does one do it differently if there are children involved? Can one work with community organisations that maybe work with people who don't typically have access to rural spaces? Or are there things we could do with similar practices in these urban spaces, in these little islands of green? Because, you know, there's a lot going on, you know, in these little pockets of growth in the city as well these days. So these are some questions that we've got open for the future.
So you think you can see this project hopefully developing, and you go and do more of these experiences, and then hopefully expand this to the wider world. Would you recommend people to do anything now just from these first initial findings? Is there anything that you would say on the individual level, just as a person that might be listening to this podcast now, to do in their garden or in the park or wherever they might be? And also, is there something where you would recommend, maybe if someone's listening, they work for a charity or they have young children, is there anything that you'd recommend them to do?
Slowing down. I mean, it feels like a cliche to say that, doesn't it? And if someone said to me, slow down, I'd probably explode because I have so much to do, right? But I think just thinking about temporalities, like the speed at which we do things and the speed at which other things do things, the speed at which a rock does its thing. And if there's any way to find any kind of alignment between those two, then that would be amazing. And just,
I mean, I think somehow this it's all very traumatic. Trigger warning to listeners, but it brings me back to the COVID experience and the things that I think we all learned from those periods where we had to stay inside. You know, how important it was to use that opportunity to leave the house when you were allowed to, just to change your focal distance and be able to look a little bit further towards the horizon where there are some trees or whatever it was. Excuse me. For me, that thing, and I remember, you know, at work there were sort of conversations, invitations that came through the Teams networks to sort of take a lunchtime walk and come back and just reflect. And I think, you know, what became very apparent to me was how important it is to give ourselves permission to take a bit of time away from that hurry that we're doing all of the time. We have, you know, stressful lives, we're juggling a lot of demands, but actually if you just stop and notice something, anything really, just, you know, right at the moment, spring seems to have come quite late this year. I've been, you know, I was walking through the park with my daughter the other day. She really wanted to spend some time noticing which of the trees had blossomed already and which was starting to bud and all of those things. And it's really important just to notice and not let ourselves be so cut off from it that we don't see these changes, because suddenly you look up and it's past already, you know.
But I think maybe about that as well, it's about doing things and to change your natural change your natural habit. So the walking slowly, just walk with your eyes closed, blindfold, walk backwards, walk low to the ground. You know, these are really easy things. It's not complicated. You might feel a bit foolish, but actually it's when you change your natural habits or your natural practices that you then can start observing things, all the amazing things that are going on.
Yeah, nice. I might try that on my way home. Maybe not on my own. Walking backwards, I might be like, excuse me.
But maybe that's also an important point,
Maybe
because
it
was
is, yeah.
very much a practice. It was about co-creation as well, and we wanted to make a very horizontal environment. We engaged in the same activities with, although when I asked everybody to close their eyes, I did keep mine open. I felt a sense of responsibility at that point. But you know, for the most part, we did the kind of observing and making together as well. But the fact that it wasn't just one person on their own, but it was actually a group of people. So going for a walk with a friend and stopping and observing, maybe that's even more important.
You mentioned as well before that you know, these moments where you all came together and you all ate together were really important, and this sense of community and this sense of, you know, camaraderie, and everyone missed the same train together and things like that. I personally think that building communities and networks is like fundamental to being able to solve the climate crisis. And I think there's a, you know, we live such secular, individualistic lifestyles, particularly in the West. And I think people are craving for this, for this sense of community again. And I think, you know, until we can reach more of these like accessible communities and things like that, that's when we're going to be able to make some serious progress and change. Do you think something like what you guys did really helped to foster a sense of community?
I think it did over those 2 days that we were working together. I don't know how far that's extended. We haven't followed that up, but definitely over the 2 days while we were there, the kind of what I thought were perhaps some more peripheral activities of the camping, the eating, all of those things were actually became very core to the practice. And I think what enabled or established the trust that then enabled all the other things to happen.
Yeah.
And you guys are both, you both have very busy lives. You're lecturers, you're also researchers, you're also mothers. You have very busy lives. How do you find, as a woman, juggling everything, and how does it, how do you deal with that?
I mean, it is quite a challenge. I think it's a significant challenge. This was a residential project. We had to think about how much time we could ask participants to do, but also how much time we could take away from home ourselves. And I think some of the feedback was that maybe it could have been longer, but we didn't want to ask people for more than 2 days in the first instance because we didn't know whether people would have that time to commit. So there are these questions of how frequently one gets to engage in projects like this. It does take quite a force of will to carve that time out, actually. We did make an exhibition of some of the outputs as well, as of documentation and the things that were made in the autumn last year. And again, it was a great thing to do, but there's a point where you have to kind of find some extra time in amongst all this, the teaching schedule and things like that. And it's quite an endurance contest.
Yeah. And I think with my research at the moment also, I'm trying to kind of actually acknowledge that the fact that, you know, my 2 children are part of my assemblage, and actually what they're doing and their kind of temporalities very much impact how and when the work I can make as well, in terms of what time of year it is, how much time I can take. I have to do the school runs either side. But actually, rather than that all remaining hidden, which I think is what we're often quite encouraged to do, is that just has to happen. Really trying to be very open about it and kind of understanding how that shapes the work that I make.
Yeah, because it almost seems like, I don't have children myself, but it almost seems it's like the children and then the work.
Yeah.
And it I feel like that separation puts so much pressure on women.
Yeah.
Especially, and how if there was more of a blended, maybe you don't want your children at work, but like, you know, if there was more of a blended where you get a bit more extra time to go and like be with your children in the morning, or take that time to take them to school and things, so there's not much pressure, might be more helpful.
Or for me, it's even just acknowledging the kind of, for some projects, they're based on woodlands where my children like to go. And they'll play and I'll do my drawings or photographs or whatever it is, site writing. And actually, rather than that being something that needs to be covered up, that's a kind of affordance that's given to my work, because a site is able to hold both things.
Yeah. Is that something you would do in the future if you was to do this project again?
I would love to do something that's intergenerational.
Absolutely.
Like,
my daughter was like so sad that I didn't take her.
Yeah. I think we've kind of both cultivated
you have
children
to go to
that
school.
like this kind of thing.
But yeah, I think we were quite keen on that idea. I think, you know, there is also a question, you bring your own children and then there's a larger group, and there may be an uneven dynamic in the sense that you already have particular relationships with your own children. So I think, you know, yes, I would like to do that, but I also think it needs managing quite carefully as well, to make sure that it doesn't create an unbalanced situation. But I also think as Anushka says, that, you know, being a parent is also quite an important part of allowing us to kind of imagine practices like this, because in a way we do little things with our kids as they're growing up. Children have imagination, and they're kind of prepared to buy into the messiness of the outdoors in a way that maybe we sometimes get separated from as we grow up. So, you know, I see that as something that feeds quite positively into that kind of imagination and thinking about what can be done. The experience of being a parent helps with that.
Yeah.
And in the same way that we're trying to disrupt the hierarchy between human and non-human, I think if we were to do something intergenerational, it's another way of disrupting that hierarchy, because as adults we always think that we know better, we're in charge, but actually if you could put everyone, human, non-human, adults, children, all on this same kind of plateau, and find practices that enable people to kind of work with each other, or species to work with each other, I think that would be really exciting.
And like, when I was growing up, my nana always used to take us to this ancient woodland, just a tiny little strip. And you'd be like in the stream and in the mud and like in trees and things like that. I think it's so important. Like, I think that's where my love of the environment has originally come from. And I think it's so important for children to be able to get out into nature and really experience it. And they do it with their whole bodies, you know, like your research is doing. Would you do something with, do you think it's important to do things with children as well? Would you do something with children in your research going forward?
Yeah, I think we would. I mean, there's always, there are more complicated kind of ethical processes to go through when one starts dealing with participatory research for children, and one needs to think about, you know, different age groups, what sort of supervision they need. The facilitation probably needs to be a bit different. The pacing probably needs to be a bit different. But as we say, intergenerational might mean, you know, it might mean children and their wider families. I also think, you know, there's a great space for older people within it as well, because thinking about how many retired people I know do an awful lot of gardening, for example, gives them a different type of connection with the earth and with things that grow, and that they probably have something like really great to bring to that sort of environment as well.
100%.
So, you know, thinking really quite openly about what participation might be like. But yeah, would love to work with kids.
Amazing. And when I mean, we've spoken about like women's roles in sustainability, and I think just from my completely uneducated, just a personal experience, it seems to be that more women are more involved with the environment and more young women seem to be more, you know, willing to use reusable bottles or willing to make certain lifestyle changes and things like that. And it seems like there's kind of a disconnect with young men at the minute. And I think there is the patriarchy that kind of puts in, like, I think these things where it almost seems uncool for a man, or it's not manly to care, and you have to do business and you have to make money and things like this. Like, how do we break down these barriers for young men to get involved? And maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe there are young men that are getting involved.
I mean, certainly some of our participants were young men. So I think to an extent, I mean, when it comes to this sort of participatory work, there's always going to be a slightly self-selecting group of people. You know, there will also be people who might be female identified or whatever, who that are just like, I don't like getting dirty. That's not my thing. So I think in terms of wider questions of sustainability, there's probably different ways in which we need to appeal to people with different interests in terms of getting them to buy into things. You know, there's a lot of different ways of approaching environmental responsibility that don't have to involve practices like this. But it certainly isn't a space that we weren't meaning to make anybody feel uncomfortable due to whatever identity predicates at all. And I think, again, it's a question partly of different ways of understanding what it is to be empowered to take action. And, you know, I suppose if we go back to kind of normative ideas about kind of gendered ways in which the world is shaped, I'm thinking about a book I was reading recently by a visual culture theorist called T.J. Demos, it's called Against the Anthropocene, and he was writing a kind of critical appraisal of the Anthropocene as a concept to be drawn on as a way of addressing environmental problems at the current time, and saying that the problem with this idea is it's so global and it's so all-encompassing that it seems to, first of all, assume that every human is equally culpable, and secondly, that every human is equally impacted, and this simply isn't true. Because actually what we're looking at in terms of what's caused the crisis point that we're in is very much something that's an inheritance of Enlightenment Prometheanism, which is arguably, you know, a European culture-derived, quite masculinist way of looking at the world. We use our rational minds to conquer nature, and we, you know, extractivism kind of comes out of a mentality that is in concert with dominant normative masculinist ideals. Whereas the sorts of practices we're doing were much more inspired by kind of decolonial pedagogies and things, where we're thinking about the way that different types of indigenous thinking, for example, are coming to feed back in and actually propose much more grassroots and pragmatic responses to problems that might be kind of local and situated. I was at an exhibition recently and saw a really inspiring bit of work where it's an artist who's working with sisal, but they actually, were looking at, so this is a substance that's a sort of, comes out of agave succulent plants, and they were looking at deforestation in an area, I think, of Brazil, and started working with indigenous communities. So this is where rainforest has been slashed and burnt for growing soya to feed animals that goes all over the world. Basically, the soil blows away and then you get left with a barren land. And he started to work with indigenous communities to, first of all, look at the way that the agave plants can help recultivate. So they started terracing, building these terraces on the hillsides where all the soil has gone, and they're using agave planting to start to retain, so when the rainwater runs off it stays there, and that the soil is starting to regrow. But then also using the sisal that comes out of this managed planting and working with these indigenous communities in his workshop to make artworks it's selling, and it goes back to fund. And then just hundreds of hectares that they had started to rebuild a landscape so that it could start to slowly reforest itself. And it was such an inspiring thing to look at. And it was just, here is someone who's doing something that is so genuinely grassroots. And it's so far away from this kind of Anthropocene kind of discourse. It's like we have to fix everything, tech giants, oil companies, governments and things like that. And it's like, actually, people do things on the ground that grow out of communities, they grow out of cooperation, and they grow out of a real sensibility of what goes on in the earth, what goes on in ecosystems. These things make real differences that are positive. And, returning to the book about the Anthropocene, what the principal argument was that we need different ways of imagining a future. We can't have a positive, affirmative, constructive politics if we can't imagine a world otherwise. And I think that these questions of, starting from ourselves and our engagements with what's close to us as a way of building new imaginaries is a really important thing to do.
For me, again, I'm not an expert in knowing about gender politics or anything like that. For me, there's something really in that idea of not being comfortable with not knowing, not having all the answers. And I often have to tell my students this, often master students who have come from a different career, male, who find it really difficult working with landscape ideas because you have to become comfortable with not knowing. You're not going to know all the plant species you need. You need to find out where to find them out. There's just too much, and it's too messy, and there's too many variables. And I think somewhere in that there's something to do with these kind of traditional male-female gendered roles. Not that's imposed on people. That in the patriarchy it's about problem solving, creating a solution, and it comes back to this idea from the Enlightenment that we are in control of nature, we're there to solve things. And even much later in London, parks were seen as a respite from the ills of the kind of urban environment. This idea that things are in opposition. And I think what we're trying to do is something that's much more relational, that's much more open-ended. And I think that is difficult, actually. I think that is difficult if you are perhaps adhering to this idea that you need to have all the solutions. That comes, I think, from a patriarchal point of view. And I feel like that's building. Actually, the patriarchy is building at the moment, more so than when I was growing up. There is this kind of sense of boys needing to be more traditionally masculine. in some instance. So I think that is going to be a hard thing to try. And how do we allow those boys to feel like they don't need to know everything? It's okay to not know, and it's okay to make mistakes and just try things out.
Yeah, and also I feel like as well, it's okay to feel your emotions as well.
Yeah,
and I think
exactly.
I think for me, I've said this for a while, like I personally think the next stage of feminism is embracing the femininity within all.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it's allowing men to say, I'm actually really upset by what you've just done, or this actually hurt me in this way, and not to have this shield and bravado, and not to just be like, I can only show anger. No, it can be anything. You have all the colours, and and I think that's across all people and genders and everything. It's embracing the femininity, because I think the 20th century, we were able to, like, as women, we could wear suits and be in business and things like that. And I think this time it's hopefully gonna be about everybody being able to accept the feminine qualities, the stereotypical feminine qualities, but which I think has brought me on very nicely to our last question. It's been such a good conversation. To something we ask all of our participants. It's interesting from your previous answer of what you said is that about the imagination, and I think when I was thinking of the podcast and how I wanted it to be designed and stuff, I was thinking about in the 80s there was this vision of the future, and it's like people on skateboards without wheels and flying cars, and there was an imagination of the future that was different to what they were living in, but better in a way. And I think now if you speak to people can think of 2050 with earthquakes and fires and devastation. I think it's really important to be able to generate and imagine a positive world of the future. So I'm interested to hear what is in your positive, hopeful vision of 2050.
For me, it's something that's much more muddy and grounded and is full of life, but different types of life, different types of small things, actually, rather than there being some kind of grand, overarching, wonderful thing that's happening. It's about that feeling things with your fingers again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would see trends in sort of design and architecture and things being much more porous and open to growing things. I think it's already going that way. I think these things, I imagine more of that. And within that, thinking about how we generate spaces for connection between people locally and globally. And I think, my hopeful thing is that, we're talking about the toxic masculinities and things, we've been going through a period where we've seen political currents kind of polarise really between some populisms that I see as quite regressive and then some much more progressive ways of looking. And I'd like to think we grow up a bit in the way we argue with each other, so that we can get over some of those extremes and start finding places where even people who feel more on the kind of traditional values side can no longer feel that it's not cool to, recycle or think about where your food came from, so that we can come back to a place where there's a bit more cooperative ways of carving out a world we can share that can keep going.
Nice. Thank you so much for your answers. They were great. Is there anything you want to add as a final note that maybe we missed in the podcast and you want to tell people before we wrap this up?
It's been really, really great to have this conversation and have some time to reflect. And I hope listeners maybe feel like they can give themselves permission now to go outside and slow down a little bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. And I hope if you did manage to get outside into nature, you've been able to observe some plants, animals, whatever you've been able to observe, and hopefully take this embodied practice into your lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. This podcast is brought to you from the Creative Futures Research Centre and the Sustainability Development Unit at the University of Greenwich. So, from all of us here, see you next time!